Hey, it's Erin. Welcome back to another episode of First Bite. And first of all, I hope everyone had a happy Valentine's Day. Um, this week has been crazy busy. I've been back in Charleston for 3 weeks. And so I'm finally unpacked, which for those of you that know me and my ADD, that is shocking. And Michelle and I are gearing up for a lot of conferences coming up. I will First Feeding Matters conference is this week, so if you're there, stop by and see Michelle. I will be at the Indiana Speech and Hearing Conference in 3 weeks, the weekend of March 14th, and then Michelle and I will both be at the Virginia Speech and Hearing Convention. So we hope to see everybody there. I'm also really excited about this episode with Dyan Dickerson that has been in the works for a long time. We connected on Instagram as two people that love both floor time and feeding. I plan to have her back on to talk more about floor time and feeding specifically, but this episode really is a deep dive into what is floor time. I talk all the time about being certified in DIR Floortime. Diane is certified in Greenspan Floortime, which are both based off of the same framework. But we really get into what is affect, how do I connect, what is the value of relationship, and really set that foundation for what you can expect if you're diving into this community. And it has such a near and dear place to my heart. And I was so happy to nerd and geek out with another floor timer, because I think once you get into the community, you connect with so many people that the cool thing about floor time is that everybody is so different but has such similar core values. And so I really, really hope you enjoy this episode. I had so much fun talking with her. We had so much fun having this conversation. And so I hope you enjoy.
All right, everybody, we are in for a treat. Erin and I have systematically over the last couple of years sought out mentors and leaders in various fields that call to our hearts. And as Erin has grown to expand her floor time certifications, you're in your final cert now for proficiency, right?
Yeah, I'll be expert in hopefully if I pass in December.
Yes. So like she's like super smart. I mean, like we knew that, but like now she's gonna have like the confirmation piece of paper, which is
Yeah.
exciting. But her world and her community within Floor Time has grown exponentially. And she told me that she found this amazing woman who lives across the pond, as my mom's
Mhm.
best friend would say. So we have none other than Dyan Dickerson, and she is a floor timer. And we are thrilled and honored that I think you stayed up late, if time zone is correct for
It's
today.
afternoon. It's nap
Yeah.
time. It works
I've only like
perfectly.
5 hours or so.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, we're 5 hours.
We're
this
used
is
to talking to people from Australia. So we're like, oh yeah, this is
it's a different day.
yeah.
Yes. But we are so grateful that you can make it. So thank you for squeezing us into your busy schedule, because y'all, she works and she's a mommy and does all the things. And on behalf of working moms everywhere, bless. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you so
Cheers.
much for having me. I'm so excited to chat. I think that I had like my floor time bubble when I worked at floor time. And then after I moved, it just has grown. And I'm like, oh my gosh, there's more of us out there. So meeting Erin, it was just so nice
Yeah.
to have that person to talk to and collaborate with and work through, emotional co-regulators
Hmm.
with a floor time term.
Well, can you take us from the beginning, like your professional walk, how you settled on your pursuit of higher ed, and then how floor time for you came to be, so we can get the backstory, and then where you work kind of now in the
Yeah,
world. Yeah.
all over. Carmen San Diego.
Yes.
Sure. So I always knew that I wanted to help have a profession, like a helping profession, but I didn't really want to go into medical. Um, I kind of wanted to work with the disability population when I was in high school. And then it kind of transformed into like the neurodivergent. She was older, she's about 10 years older than me, but we had buddy programs in my high school, and there was a young woman, and she was just so awesome. I loved talking with her. We would go for walks. We would talk about the boys that she likes. I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is a really cool woman, young lady. So that kind of steered my like focus into the neurodivergent population. I always, since high school, knew that I wanted to be a speech pathologist. My mom's cousin is one, and she works on the West Coast of Florida in Tampa. She has her own practice. She kind of had like this like golden ball. I don't know a different word for it, but like she could work as many hours as she wanted. She had a family. She could still, she could wear all the hats. And so I knew I wanted to do something like that down the road. I wanted to have my own practice. So started undergrad. And while I was in undergrad, my best friend, and she was a cohort member in undergrad, she was like, hey, there's this job opportunity. A mom is looking for support for her autistic 2-year-old. His name is Jacob. The mom is Julie. They're like my absolute, I love them so much. We are still in contact. But Julie at the time was looking for support. She didn't like the behavioral route that was kind of being recommended. And she had stumbled upon Floortime and really resonated with the things Dr. Greenspan was talking about in the DIR model. And so when I was a sophomore, it's like year 2 of my undergrad, I started doing Floortime while I was doing the coursework. And so I was telling Erin, like, it just all like melded for me. I didn't really do one or the other first. So I worked for them, and I would go and do Floortime sessions. She kind of had several of us that would come and do like 2 hours, and we would just play in the garage, and we would do dress up and obstacle courses. And he really liked performing. They're in Orlando, so like Disney World is top, the absolute best place in the world. And so we would turn into Mickey, and it was just so much fun. And I was learning that you can join in their world, and then you can use these certain strategies that really support bridging your worlds together. So yes. I think when I was in grad school, I knew that I wanted to do Floortime, and I was like, I'm going to call the Rebecca School. I'm going to call, which is in New York City. I'm going to call the Floortime Center in DC, and I'm going to try and find ICDL in Atlanta, which is where this family was going for kind of intensives. And I started with the Floortime Center, and I remember like being in this little coffee shop and calling, and Jake Greenspan answering. I was like, I'm about to start my clinical fellowship, like just wondering if you were looking for a speech therapist, if you could have a clinical fellow. And the rest is kind of history. Like I was there for a little over 6 years. Awesome. It was we were a family. And then I moved to Florida, started my own practice, had kids, have since moved to London. My husband's job brought us here. Adventure brought us here. So yeah, we're here now. But Floortime has always been a part of it. I've always been a Floortime speech therapist.
So Erin opened my stars to the Floortime world. And I've only had like the basic class because that's bandwidth that I am running in right now with, yes. But I know the biggest misunderstanding that I've encountered from parents when I'm trying to explain it to them and like share the Floortime resources with the caregivers, because they have an amazing resource page for caregivers. And they're if they're coming at it from an ABA lens where they've had ABA previously, and I'm trying to politely explain what has been told to me. They say, well, it kind of sounds like they're just running all over and doing whatever they want. And ABA makes them sit and makes them learn how to sit and do the things that they want them to do, which it doesn't help that most states have ABA paid for by insurance, and it's still in the process of Floortime is still getting in the process. But can you just maybe clarify, while it's not, right? It's not just let the children run amok. Also a hocus pocus reference for those of you that are listening. Amok. Yeah.
Well, and I was going to say, Diane and I connected through Instagram, which, it can be a scary place, but can also be a really nice place to find like-minded people. And I remember like I'd see her post and I was like, oh, yes, like somebody's saying it. Like, yes, somebody's saying this. And then she also does feeding, and it's hard to find, Floortime and feeding is not as common. Like I don't see as many people that are really comfortable doing both, because feeding is a very intense You need to have a lot of knowledge. You need to have understanding of, medical comorbidities and referrals and swallowing. And it can be scary for some people, but it is so easily, like floor time goes with everything. I use floor time with everyone in my life. And it's a lens and a mindset. And so I wanted to bring Diane on today because we've had so many of these conversations, and I wanted to bring this to our First Bite audience of not just what is floor time, but how is floor time.
Yes.
And how do we critically think? Michelle and I talk all the time with feeding. It is so much critical thinking piece. And that's what floor time allots for clinicians. And it really is the how, which is not black and white. Mm-hmm. And that's what we really want to get in today of like, how are we thinking about our patients? How are we building this muscle of floor time? Essentially, we're floor timing ourselves, but I'll let Diane.
Oh my gosh, I use that phrase all the time. Yeah, like I'm floor timing myself. Like, and it's meant in the nicest way possible, but like I'll floor time the teachers at schools that I'm working at, because if I go at a behavioral kind of adult directed route and I just teach, if they're not processing, if we don't have a relationship, if we're not meeting on some sort of understanding level, then it's just in one ear and out the other. They might have these programs that look beautiful, but they're not tailored to the individual needs and individual differences of the child or the relationship between the child and the person doing it. So Michelle, to your kind of point of what parents have kind of brought to you, they've done that to me as well. And I tell them, if you're working with a floor time therapist and they're just letting the child run around and jump off tables and like go willy-nilly, then they're not a good floor time therapist. They might be doing their approach of like child-led therapy, but a big piece of floor time is that challenge and knowing the just right challenge. And in order to find that just right challenge, you have to have a relationship with that child. You have to know how their kind of foundation is working, and it's ever changing. They could be, one day they could see you and they're like on, and you get into this really dynamic back and forth, and then the next day they're dysregulated because of XYZ factors. And so you have to start at that foundational level. But that's kind of what I say is like, if it looks like they're just running around, then they're probably not doing floor time. They're finding the fun. And in my first session or first part of a session with a new family, I'll tell the parents, I'll preface it with, it's not going to look like I'm pushing them right now, because you have to build that relationship. You have to have rapport so that you can challenge them. If that's helpful, that's kind of my verbiage.
Yes. So, I love the family guided routines based intervention, the FGRBI model, which Dr. Juliana Woods, it's her brainchild. And the whole premise is on caregiver coaching and how to piggyback off of Erin's how does floor time look? How I have seen Erin's videos and I've learned from her, and watching her coach the caregiver into how to be part of the co-regulation aspect, she always says read the room, but like read the room and read their child. What are your suggestions for how to pull that caregiver in so they're not hanging out on the sidelines, but actually knowing how to do this themselves at home?
And that's a big part of where I did my training, was at the Floor Time Center, and there's kind of the levels of training. And that was one of the higher ones where like you are qualified to train, not train, but to coach caregivers. But similarly, I would say, you read the room and you join them in their world. And, a parent might not want to go 400 miles an hour spinning around on a swing, but you can still join them in what they're doing by making comments, by using your affect. I have sessions where like talking is not the top important thing. We're communicating without talking. We're using that affect. We're using those exclamatory phrases. So I try and model for parents initially, because sometimes it feels really silly. As a parent, unless you are in our field, you have not played in probably 20 years. because you haven't been a kid in 20 years. So starting to play with your child and then adding these neuro diversity or, you know, neurodivergence or just the differences in there, these individual differences for kids that they have to also be factoring into how they're playing, it can be really hard and really intimidating. And that's, I've had families that I've worked with, and it's just all about helping and reinforcing their confidence and their trust in doing this, and also recognizing first and foremost that doing floor time can be emotionally, mentally, and physically draining and exhausting. It's so worth it. But I think that's where maybe some of the ABA, where it's a very passive, it's adult directed, you have this explicit direction of what you're doing and how you're logging it. Whereas floor time doesn't look like that, because that's, you know, not the natural dynamic of two people. It's not, you know, in a school, maybe it's adult directed where kids have to sit and listen, which is a whole nother thing. But I think that floor time is a very natural dynamic. And so parents have to kind of work up to that. Being able to do it, it's not something you do all day, every day. That's another kind of misconception, is like parents want, you know, meal time to go easier, or they want transitioning to the car to go easier. Can they floor time then? And it's really about building your confidence as a parent in those kind of like 15-20 minute, you know, if Dr. Greenspan was alive today, I don't know what he would say as far as like time commitment to this, because I think as parents, we're just so stretched compared to parents maybe 20-30 years ago. I don't know. But that was kind of his like launching off point, was you want to do several 20-minute sessions a day. And I think it's because it's tiring, it's taxing, but once you get going with it and you feel more confident and you recognize that you're having fun alongside your child, it makes it a lot easier. So it's just that, you know, strengthening muscles at the gym, you just have to kind of get going with it.
You said muscles at the gym, and we were discussing the mom arm this weekend, and I was like, yeah, it waves back at me now.
Yeah, you know, I thought they would be so strong from like carrying toddlers up and down stairs, but like, no.
Well, and we haven't, I don't know why we haven't had like a true episode discussing floor time. I think because I haven't had my expert certification. So I was like, I don't feel like I want to make sure I like, you know, feel fully competent before I bring this to this platform, because I really value floor time and like want to do it justice. And so I do feel like for our audience, I would love to talk a little bit more today about like the true foundation of floor time and like what that means, because to your point, I think people are either intimidated by floor time or like don't fully understand it. And I know floor time is like, the name can be a little misleading because it doesn't need to be done on the floor. A lot of times it is, but it doesn't need to be done on the floor. But there's these big principles for it. And some of the things that I think us as speech therapists like really benefit from with floor time is the understanding of connection and affect, because those are so integral to everything that we do. But I would love, you know, your perspective on floor time as a whole, so we can like get a better foundation for like what we're going to be talking about today in regard to like critical thinking and how we assess and work with a child.
Sure. So floor time is kind of two parts. Well, floor time is the approach, and DIR is the model that we're using when we're using the approach. And you can't have one without the other. So DIR stands for, and it's a little bit different between Greenspan, floor time, and ICDL. But developmental is, we're looking at milestones, right? We're looking at that shared interest. And these are not neurodivergent versus neurotypical milestones. They're just developmental, social emotional developmental milestones. That shared interest, that kind of, you know, I remember I got not laughed at, they thought it was very sweet, but I remember Dr. Greenspan at one point saying, you know, engagement is that like it's that falling in love milestone where like your baby is falling in love with you as a parent because they're engaging with you. And they just thought that was so sweet. It was kind of like a thing that I hooked onto of Dr. Greenspan's. But you kind of work up from that shared attention and that engagement, and then the ability to just have a very simple back and forth. It could be I squeeze your finger and you pull on my finger. I squeeze your finger and you know, from like infancy, or it can be I roll a ball to you and you roll the ball back to me. But then you just keep working up. And I think that's another misconception with floor time is it's only good for autistic kids, or it's only good for kids that are 0 to 3 or 0 to 4. But in reality, like strengthening these foundational milestones leads to so much academic success, and not just academic success, but like relationship success, being a reflective thinker, being able to make decisions based on your own internal preferences. So those are kind of all the D's scattered about. But then the individual differences, and Dr. Greenspan spoke a lot about, you know, the sensory differences, you're hyper, you're hypo. And I was telling Erin that, you know, if I had known about OT before I had gone the speech path, I might have been an occupational therapist. Because that sensory world is so fascinating to me, and it's so impactful on communication. And it's just absolutely mind-blowing that speech therapists in grad school, you don't learn about sensory. What is sensory?
But no, yes, right there. So folks, if you are listening, and I know a fair few of you are faculty or clinical faculty, we have to teach this. I understand that there is a role and a purpose for researchers and for ongoing research. But if your department is research heavy and doesn't have faculty that actually practice, please host floor time at your facility. We've got, reach out to Erin and I, because good Lord knows we know plenty of people who would volunteer their time, but we have to teach how to make the connections, because this is a huge shift that aligns with ASHA laying the framework to get rid of the 375 hours and going towards the competency-based clinical model. This right here is what she's talking about. We have to teach this. Sorry. Soapbox.
Good. Nice moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, the individual differences are those sensory components, but also language development. And Erin and I were kind of talking about like GLPs versus analytic language processors. And that's an individual difference. And as the floor time speech therapist, OT, whatever you are, you have to understand those individual differences, because otherwise it's going to be, what is that saying? Like square peg, round hole. Like you're going to be trying to do something and it's just not working.
Yeah.
But so looking at the individual differences of their communication mode, are they using spoken language? Are they still using gestural language and working on becoming stronger with that? Are they using AAC? Are they, you know, writing or letterboarding? And I don't know much about that. But there's just so many modes of communication, and it's not a one size fits all approach to working on communication. So those are kind of those individual differences. The family, is it a mom and dad? Is it two moms? Is it a single parent? Do they live with grandparents? Are they in foster care? Like those all are really important pieces of information we need to know about a child to support them. And then that R, which is like if I could have like a little golden emoji, is that relationship. You have to have a relationship. And that's why I cringe when I see some people come in to do therapy and it's like, all right, like sit at the table, you get a sticker. Do this task, you get this reward for it. Doesn't matter the relationship you have with a child. It's this kind of like superior, inferior, or whatever that analogy is of like, you listen to me and you'll get rewarded for listening to me.
Instead of food, when they have the tackle box of food and yet they have feeding goals, and it's literally a tackle box of like mini M&Ms or goldfish. And I'm like, we're poisoning our children and not teaching how to honor their, yeah.
So we had a client when we were doing feeding therapy, and I might get it reversed, but she would come in and she would say iPad, because every time she ate something, she got an iPad. So she didn't associate mealtime with food. She associated it with getting that reward. Yeah. And it's almost like you have to like pull all of that stuff out and then kind of like fill them up with the really affective what works to see the progress, because otherwise you're competing. And especially when you get these older kids that have come in and have done more traditional therapy, more traditional feeding therapy, and you're like, oh my gosh, like this is actually harder than supporting a 3-year-old in feeding.
Yes.
But so that's the DIR. And then floor time is you follow their lead, you join in their world. Again, they're doing something dangerous, they're doing something not allowed, you set limits. And that's such a misconception with floor time. I remember Jake, my boss, Jake Greenspan, he would get so angry if like he would just walk in and like a kid is just like running wild in the room and you're like, but I'm following their lead. And he's like, no, that is not following their lead. They're going to become overstimulated, dysregulated, no connection. So you follow the lead, but then you challenge, and you're following the lead while also simultaneously supporting those individual differences. So finding the right sensory input, taking sensory inputs out, using your affect to join them in that world. But it's so cringe worthy, but it's also so effective. One thing I tell parents, and that I do myself, and we did at Floor Time, is video your session, because in the moment you might feel completely like weird, but in the moment you can't tell all of the beautiful things that are happening, and you can't track that. So going back and reflecting, which is the 9th milestone, going back and reflecting, like, oh, that worked well, or like I used too much language. And that was feedback I would get all the time. I love to talk. I've cut it back in my sessions a lot, but Tim would come in and be like, stop talking. You are talking too much. And I'm like, but I'm a speech therapist.
That's literally all we're taught in grad school.
Yeah.
We're
Model.
Model. Yeah.
Yeah. But like
structure.
Yes. But you know what? This goes back to, when was the last time our faculty practiced? And like, honestly, there's an anomaly. Like, within academia, I know that some universities and some programs require professors to carry a caseload within the clinic. It keeps it clinically relevant. But if we haven't done that, then we're creating generations of clinicians that are not learning current evidence-based practice from an interprofessional perspective, because that's what blew me away when I took that first class is I assumed it was going to be OT and SLPs only in the first class for floor time. It was not. I was actually only one of 2 SLPs, and there was only 1 OT. There was nurses, there were parents, there were teachers, there were early interventionists, there was all of these things. And I was like, all of us can do this? And that was just... But also, hell yeah, all of us can do this, because it's all of us have stakeholder buy-in. We're all part of these tiny humans' world. But
yeah,
and we are humans. That's what it takes. Like, I'm sorry, Erin, but like AI is such a big part of our life right now. But I'm like, I will always have a job because I am a floor timer, and like we will always hopefully need human connection. But yeah, exactly. Like, you have stakeholder, you are a part of this child's life, and like you collaborate, and you get to, that's one thing I took for granted and didn't realize until I left floor time, was like, I get to have these check-ins and these conversations and these, talks with OTs. We had a visual cognitive therapist at the Floor Time Center that did, like, I always say it's like, I can say it's amazing, but I can't actually say what he's doing because it's just so intricate and specialized. But we had floor timers, we had a music therapist, we had an art therapist. So it's really nice to have that collaborative effort and support and kind of teamwork, that all have their fingers in the pot. I don't know another analogy. Like, we're all involved.
And it, Michelle and I talk all the time from like a feeding perspective of the why. Like, why are you doing what you're doing? What do you know about this child from, like, especially with our medically complex kids, from a medical standpoint, from a feeding, swallowing, from their trauma, from their history? And floor time, that's a huge piece of that. That's where that individual differences in development comes from, is what do I know about this child? And I use the example of, like, someone will ask me, what's a neurodiversity affirming or floor time goal? And my answer is the same goal written the same way. Granted, there's goals I would tell you for any child would not be, but goal could be written the same way and be neurodiversity affirming and trauma informed for one child, but not for another. And so, Diane talking about a child running around the room, why are they doing it? What is your goal? what are you like, you need to know why this is happening, and that may be information, but again, floor time helped me understand that, and I knew this in my heart, but like every child wants connection. Like every human wants connection and relationship. And so where I think we get lost in this world of a lot of us working towards child-led play-based therapy is there's moments of connection, but there's so much more opportunity for connection. Like you're supporting what they want to do, but connection can be stressful and sometimes dysregulating, but we need to work through that dysregulation and feel safe in it. So I watch a lot of therapists talk about child-led play-based, and they may not push them for moments of, or challenge them for moments of connection because it is dysregulating. Dysregulation is okay if you have this relationship and you're supporting it. So you have to understand why you're doing what you're doing. But again, we have to challenge. There are so many children who do not have those moments of connection and relationship because someone doesn't get them and they're not challenging them. And you see these older kids that come in and they've developed their own means of feeling connected to something, but you have to take steps back. Like sometimes I work on these foundational, body, sensory, just us together in this moment, because these kids have these splintered skills because no one took the time to truly understand them and connect with them in a way that feels safe for them. And that's the beauty of floor time. Like we can't give up on them. Like they want that. And so, and to Diane's point too, like floor timers, like is just this beautiful community of people that want to support kids and want to support each other. And like every floor time, like truly floor time practice that I've visited, like they will sit with each other after a hard session and just co-regulate and be supportive because they understand that it is so emotional and it is so challenging. It's hard. This is really, really challenging, but it's like the most beautiful thing.
Yeah. And to the point of like the kid running around the room, I know we're using this analogy and I know we've all probably had that client in a session, especially if you have that sensory gen. Like sometimes they need to move their body, but we can support them in finding a more organized way. And we always would start feeding sessions. Parents would come in that had gone to different feeding therapy, and it would be like, all right, like, where's the feeding room? And we're like, no. We're starting in the sensory gym because we need to get this back and forth going. I need to, support their regulation and figure out where their regulation is today and figure out where their kind of ideas are today. Are they trying to climb stuff? Okay, cool. Then we'll use climbing when we move into the feeding room. Or are they, I had a little boy that would, he liked pirates and he knew he was coming into feeding. And out of all of the stuffed animals, the carrot stuffed animal was the bad pirate of the day. I'm like, all right, like we need to work on the emotional connection to feeding. It's not just a sensory thing. It's not just a behavioral thing. It's not a behavioral thing. I don't know. It just makes me so angry when I hear that. But it's just so much more of an emotional connection to mealtime. And that's where I found that floor time really supported these kiddos, especially because they probably had come from a really long line of having difficult mealtimes. Mealtime was not fun for them or their family. And so that was kind of my goal. Our goal was making mealtime fun. If we and I totally can empathize with like, but my child needs to eat or else they're going to come tube fed soon. There's this level of like emotional stress that is on the parents, and then parents being their child's person, children can feel that stress too. They've gone from being a co-regulating partner to not being able to co-regulate. And it's completely understandable. So you have to, again, look at the individual differences, but supporting a child, and the other kind of term that I think is really important for us is to remember that active participation is where the connections are made to what these kids are doing. Passively participating in something, what's the point? So you can check it off your box.
Yes,
literally. So I think,
sorry, that's what happens. There's boxes. I've seen them checked. Yes.
I remember I had to do a kind of a behavioral route in grad school. You had to try the things. Interestingly, floor time wasn't one of those, but we had to do an ABA round, and there was, we had to have our goals, and I had to have my trials and my my X's versus circles or X's versus one line. And it was just like, holy moly, I have to, focus so much on my data documentation that like, I have zero idea what I'm getting into with this child. Whereas floor time, it's a little bit, again, trickier to track progress quantitatively, but qualitatively speaks mountains. And you see the connection that a kiddo can start to make with their parent, because both parties are better at making connections and both parties have a stronger relationship. It's not just we're changing this child, we're supporting the parents in connecting with a child in a way meaningful for them. But you see the just joy that parents and kids can have together, and you're like, done, job is done.
Yes.
Because that's what it's all about. Like, of course I want to support communication, and like Erin said, the challenge is where that happens. But if you can have that, be a witness and be somewhat connected to this positive interaction between a parent and a child, it makes my job, that's like makes it worthwhile.
Okay, two thoughts, and then I will have to graciously bow out. But for those of us that are coming at it but I have to have the data, because let's be honest, there's a huge, that's how we were raised as baby speech, right? So if you're so used on focusing on the quantitative data, what Diane was describing, having the qualitative data, if you need a metric in order to measure the qualitative data for your place of employment, for your practice setting, I recommend that you go back and check out the prom episode with Dr. Jean Marshall and Dr. Memory Goza, because prom supports it's a psychometric testing for the psychosocial component, the domain of pediatric feeding disorder. So if we're looking at those 4 domains, we have medical, feeding skill, nutrition, and psychosocial. But there are free proms, free screenings, free truly well-normed tools to get qualitative data, one of them being from UNC Chapel Hill. And you can give the 10-15 questionnaire to the caregiver at the start of initial eval and then periodically throughout, so that if you feel you have to quantify your qualitative data, you have a tool to do so, but it focuses on the joy, which is both of what you're saying. So also there's a time and a place to put feeding therapy on hold, to say, hey, we have to have communication so we understand the relationship and how they're feeling about this, put a pin on it. And where are we engaging in speech generating devices, and why are we not putting them in their hands right away? So there's that little nugget. Just put that.
And I don't know if it's a thing over here, I'm just noticing it more, but schools, a lot of schools, majority of schools, most of them are very apprehensive to a child's device going in. And I'm like, what in the world? And I understand that there's like a level of legality, or like, they don't want to be liability there. But like at the same time, that's a child's voice. You wouldn't take away a wheelchair, or you wouldn't, I don't know, whatever other comparisons are out there. But I just hear that and I'm like, but at the same time, with my floor time background, I have to support them in coming to that conclusion themselves. Because if they have a speech therapist come in, tell them that kid needs their AAC after they've been hesitant to it, guess what? I'm not going to be allowed back to school the next week. So it's supporting the partner in understanding, or the educational party to understand that these kids need their SGDs for all sorts of, not just communication outside on the playground or answering questions, but to feeding and to kind of those interoceptive, I'm hungry, I need the bathroom, because otherwise we're doing them a disservice, especially if they have that symbolic communication to be able to let us know with their speech device.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm sorry I can't stay for the full.
That's okay.
I am back to back, but Diane, this is bloody brilliant. And
oh, good.
Can I go ahead and put a request in to have you back for a second time? And then
I would love to.
Yes, and then the person that you talked about, the visual cog therapy, that would be cool.
John, he studied under Dr. Wax. He's like a visual therapist, like Dr. Greenspan's age. But he is absolutely brilliant at what he does. And you see him come in with these like laser things and just like cool little toys. And he understands the floor time, you know, the developmental. We're not going to just jump it from up top down. We're going to support from the ground up. And it was really cool to work alongside him. Yeah, I'll share his contact.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Erin, you're amazing. Thank you for connecting.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Bye.
Talk soon. Yeah, bye.
Where was my train of thought? Yeah, I think one thing I talk with people about too is like, and thinking about this analogy, but like physicians, for example, like they do assessments to understand what's going on medically. Like they take the time, they do assessments, they, you know, continue to dive in so that they can provide an appropriate treatment plan. But we don't give ourselves enough time to learn about the child relationship wise and their individual differences to develop a true plan of care that best supports them. And so I talk a lot, and I've recently just started writing goals for myself. Like what I'm going, you know, SLP will work to develop a, you know, best fit for communication supports for a child through different trials and whatever. And then I can document in that session, like I tried this is what happened, because we put all the onus on the child. Like we're a team, we're a part of this, but I'm also talking about like what skill I'm providing, because I think we don't like give ourselves credit for all the skilled things that we're doing. And that's where people get lost in floor time too, is they're like their perspective of skill and what's valuable is very different. And that's even why like I developed a goal bank and I'm, you know, working on my goal writing course, because I'm like, I used to be the one that was like, oh, I hate writing goals. Like I hate writing goals. They're so hard to write. I don't want to write them. But goals can completely shift the way someone views your plan, the way you like when you write good goals, that's like a lens into how you're doing what you're doing. And so if we shift that perspective, that can be so helpful, as opposed to like, what am I getting the child to do? Because like you said, floor time is, I'm a firm believer both in feeding and communication therapy that like we don't trust our kids enough. Like we think we literally have to teach them every single thing that they do, but if we allow them to build this intrinsic, you know, understand what they want and what's motivating for them, you can use that foundation in so many areas and become more flexible. Like flexibility is important. That's a sign of a healthy brain. Like we have to help children be flexible, but if we just teach them these skills, we're not setting them up for any sort of success.
No, that flexibility, first of all, I really like the idea of writing your self goals. And I think as humans, as adults, we write our, you know, we have goals for ourselves, for our family, or our, you know, our partners. But I've not really thought about it in like a like a business sense. Sure, my goal for my business, but like deeper as a therapist, that's really interesting. I'm gonna have to think about what kind of goals I would write for myself, because to your point, we don't give ourselves enough credit. And I think with floor time, sometimes you can get lost in the like little details and not see. Dr. Greenspan had a quote, and it was like, you know, don't lose the forest for the trees. It was in one of his books. Like you don't want to just focus on, can they tie their shoes? Can they answer WH questions? Can they request X, Y, and Z? But instead, like we need to be supporting the kind of big picture. And I think as a floor time therapist, sometimes I know I'm hard on myself. My husband is like, give yourself a break. Like you would not challenge or be that hard on a colleague, on a child, on a parent, you know, like give yourself a break. But I think we're hard on ourselves because we don't see the data, the quantitative, but seeing that qualitative, it just like erases all of that self-doubt. But yeah, that's really interesting, the giving yourself goals, because I think it can be like life changing, you know, or like practice changing.
And we were talking about this before we hit the record button, but floor time also supports true critical thinking with the families that we work with. You know, I am the first to say, and you know, I pull from a lot of OT models because OT is based more on these bigger models, where the speech therapy field is based on this deficit-based model. So you're labeling. And unfortunately, what that, you know, all the big nine aside from like AAC, which is a supportive of communication, but the big 9 are all deficits and individual differences, but they are a individual difference. Gestalt language processing is an individual difference. And so it is a piece of the puzzle, but that child is more than just a GLP. That child, there's so many pieces to this child. And I love, how we're understanding about delayed echolalia and supporting their communication, but there is a lot more to that. And so what Floortime does to looking at these individual differences is I'm not saying I'm specifically treating outside of my scope, but my understanding of that is bigger, like holistic. I'm understanding, and that plays a role in everything that I do. You don't show up to mealtime and take all the other individual differences and like leave them at the door. All those individual differences show up at mealtime. That's a part of you and who you are. And so we have to understand that. And so much feeding therapy, communication therapy, I think, is so focused on the one thing that it's almost we expect kids to drop it. And we can't. We have to look at, maybe when they were refusing something, it wasn't because of the food. Maybe it was because they had a hard day and it was too much sensory input. Maybe it was, maybe they're not communicating as much today. Or, I have a kid that like, is speaking, was partially speaking, has the communication device. And there may be days where he uses the communication device more. And that could, may have to do with so many of these other individual differences. So while I'm focused on communication and feeding, I have to understand that there's so many other things going on. And it's not just about what I want it to be about. Like it's about this child. And some of the conversations I have with caregivers in a session aren't what I was thinking I was going to work on. It's about other aspects, but they do play into that. And we have to be critical thinkers, and we have to be willing to say we don't know, and we have to be willing to work through it. And a lot of speech therapists have a really hard time with going into a session and not knowing.
Yes. And I don't know if that's like systemic coming from like our professors, but like if is this still recording?
Yeah.
Okay. So like I've been doing this now for 12 years, and like there are still things I do not know. I have zero idea about. So just for people that are like new to this field or maybe have been in it for a while, it's okay to not know. I think what really is a disservice is acting like or instead of being open-minded, thinking that your way or the highway is the only way to go. Because at the end of the day, like our input and our kind of impact is only a slice of that child's pizza, and what their own preferences, which if they're speaking or can use some sort of symbolic communication, that's amazing. Otherwise, we have to do the detective work. But the child and their family's wishes and wants and desires trump everything that we, are pushing as therapists. So I think that that's another thing is like we have to remember that we are just a passenger in this ride, and probably a backseat passenger. That we have to really provide our suggestions through that lens of developmental and relationship based, instead of like you were saying deficit based, instead of they can't do this. Let's look at what they can do and then build up on that foundation. But then at the end of the day, what I've had to learn to do, and I still reflect on this, is like my ability to listen. And critical thinking is so important for our field. And I don't know if we said this before we recorded, but like, I think there's just so much information so readily available now that being a critical thinker is really hard, because you have to take this all in, decide what resonates with you and what you're processing, and then pursue it further. But critical thinking is so valuable. And I think being reflective on your own regulation as that therapist, and remembering that just because a kiddo is doing something, or a parent might be frustrated or dysregulated themselves, you can't take it personally. They're communicating, and just because they're having this feel doesn't mean it's directly related to you. And being a Floortime therapist, you can do your best to co-regulate. But I think listening is not just listening, but like hearing, processing what others are saying through their spoken language or through their body,
Yeah.
is really important.
Yeah. And I have two things I want to make sure we touch on. One, I would love, and I put you on the spot because I didn't tell you. I know people love like a good case study. So I have one case study. If you can think of any, like, any patient, I'm still in the medical mindset,
I know.
client that you've worked with. I always correct myself, client that you worked with. Because I feel like our clients are like our teachers. So I love to talk about like things we've learned from our clients, but also thinking about like what, for those of us who, people who are listening who maybe don't fully understand affect, because I feel like affect can be challenging to grasp at first. One thing I want to also mention too, thinking about like this holistic viewpoint, is that what it supports also. So, I'm really trying to support a child's communication. A child can't do everything that's hard at the same time.
No.
So the more I know about their praxis, the more I know about their sensory system, the more I know about their trauma, I can support that to give them a good foundation for building that communication. Just like with feeding, if I'm working with a medically complex child, I'm going to get them a good chair. I'm going to get them in a good position. I'm going to find food that they like, that's supportive of their oral motor skills. I'm going to build a routine so they understand what's going to happen. We have to know what to support to facilitate growth in other areas. Because if you put me in a scenario where everything was hard and I had no support, I'm not going to develop. And so that's why it's not just, I let the child do whatever they want. If you have a child, for example, that has difficulties with praxis, they have challenges with motor planning. I have this idea, but I don't quite know what to do with my body to make this happen. And we have episodes, Kara McWaters, my OT partner in crime, her and I did an episode talking about praxis, which is essentially how I develop a new motor plan. Like, what's my idea for something I want to do? And so a lot of our kids have these ideas, but they don't know what to do. If I know that, when I, say a child walks into the sensory gym and they just stare at it, I need to know about that child. Are they staring at it because they're dysregulated and there's too much sound and there's another kid in there? Are they staring at it because they don't know what to do with their body, so they're pausing because they don't have a motor plan? Are they standing there because they have trauma from past therapy and this is their first session with me? Again, the same action, behavior, whatever it is, could mean something so different for every child, but we have to understand that. And that's where I get a little frustrated on social media when people will say like, oh, they're doing this because of this. That child might be, but that doesn't mean that the next child that does the same thing is doing it for the same reason. And that's where social media can get tricky, and the black and white can get tricky, because like, it is not black and white. And so the more I know, if I know that that child has, say praxis is the challenge, can I help put them in an environment that maybe is easier for them to navigate, that's less overwhelming? Can we develop a routine that they know exactly what's going to happen? And then that's where the communication can grow. So floor time allows you to best build this support for this child to help grow in other areas. So now if I grow their communication, then when they're put in a scenario where praxis is difficult or something else, can they use the communication that I've helped them grow to explain that and advocate for themselves? Like, that's also the beauty of floor time.
And to that point, you've not just helped them by teaching them, you've helped them make meaningful connections to their ideas so that they can call on that communication, purpose or intentionality, not just when they're in Erin's sensory gym, but also when they get to the playground or when they're at school. So you're supporting their regulation, but also their intentionality and that ideation. Which again, not learning about praxis, maybe like a splinter of it in grad school, but I'm like, the ideation, like that involves words, that involves our, receptive language and our understanding of the world around us, which is language. So to not have a foundation in praxis as therapists, I think we sometimes can be doing a disservice because we're looking at all of these things from the top instead of looking at that foundation.
And people always, every time I lecture, people really resonate with the quote from Dr. Erin Purvis, which I think is misquoted. And when I've dug deep for the quote, of, how often it takes repetitions of something to learn a new skill, that it takes like 200 to 300 repetitions, but within joy, it takes like 10 to 15. People say in play, I've listened to it and it doesn't matter one way or the other, but people really resonate with that. And where I hope people also understand is the benefit of affect. And like you said, these meaningful experiences. More connections happen in our brain when it's done within relationship and when it's done within an affectual, meaningful experience. So not only are we just saying this to say kids, like, this is supportive of their mental health, this is more enjoyable, this is more fun, we're also saying it because it actually works better. And I was wondering if you could touch on like what, your like affect what even is affect? Like we just keep talking about it, but like, what does that mean? How do I do it? Is it just me talking really loudly? And what I call the speech therapist, like doorbell effect, we're like, let's go, let's jump. You're okay. I'm like, why do we sound like a doorbell? Like I can't deal with it.
Yeah.
It's okay. I did too. I do it sometimes. Like I'm not judging you, any speech therapists that sound like that. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think that there is a absolute time and place for like the Miss Rachel voice. You're trying to bridge that connection and pull a child in, and maybe their auditory is, their processing is a little bit slower, so you're having to use these kind of like simple sentences. But affect, the things that it is not just this Mickey Mouse like excitement level, volume, pitch, because we have to work through a range of emotions and we communicate through a range of emotions. So affect can be frustration, it can be sadness, it can be around excitement, it can be uncertainty, it can be happiness and joy and love. But it's not just what you're saying or how you're saying it, but it's your face and your body and kind of like your energy, your presence in the moment, your tone of voice, of if you're setting a limit versus playing through something, or, I'm feeling really sad today. It's so much more how you say something and how you present yourself than what you're saying. And that's why sometimes I'll have sessions and in those moments, language, spoken words is not my, like what I'm working on. I'm not just giving them all of this language that hopefully this child can then pull on that language in a different moment to be able to use it purposefully. But instead, I'm supporting that regulation. And it's so funny because I see myself in my clients and in my own two boys of like, if I'm like working through something or like when something is hard, or like I can see my affect, how they're imitating it, because that model has been so, affective. It's such a benefit when you know how to use affect and you understand affect. It's such a benefit to what you're doing because it allows a child to process this situation, this idea in a way that's not just challenging their auditory language processing.
And it also, I always say, and we always say, like, shared meaning, not shared words. Like you work with so many kids where you may be having all this speech, but you're not on the same, like you guys aren't understanding each other. And I can have conversations with my best friend from across the room just with my face. Like that's affect. That's how we're communicating meaning. And so I encourage SLPs so often when I talk to them of like, if the meaning, and also if you got the meaning, the message was sent, and we do not need to make them say it another way. They will become more symbolic as their capacity expands and as the situation allows it. We often talk less with our loved ones, like at the end of a day, because they understand us.
Yes.
So that's why, the caregivers will say oftentimes, especially when I'm working on augmentative communication, like they're not using their device as much at home. And that's because they feel understood. And that's okay. And it's not your, don't feel like you have to break this connective moment to make something more symbolic. And so affect really allows for that expansion of meaning. And that's where connection grows. That's where true understanding grows. And I see so many kids, like I said, that like have gotten really far in because they have a lot of words and they just want to keep that moment. But then when you really ask them what they want, they have no idea, because they've just done what everyone else tells them. And like, what kind of life is that you're just at the mercy of like everybody else's decisions for you? That's not, floor time also a mental health model. Like we're supporting their mental health and their development. And so
Yeah.
making sure to think about that and giving yourself permission to not feel like, what if we documented more of those like shared meaning as opposed to how many words that they said? Again, how are we documenting? That's valuable. And I always say to people too, because I get the pushback of like insurance and blah, blah, blah. Insurance doesn't know. And if we start writing different goals, they'll get it. They'll get it. And we can have a conversation. Like that's how you make changes, is shifting your language. And we know how valuable language is. So that's, I think, another piece from like a speech therapy perspective that is really beautiful with floor time. And I think it also forces you to look at yourself and like, why am I doing, watching yourself do therapy is like not fun at first. And it's never my favorite thing, but you like, oh, my intent was this, but what was the message that was being sent when I'm watching this? Like, what was my body language? What was my face actually doing? How did they interpret this? And you can, start to learn a lot more about yourself. And
Totally.
it's hard. Yeah, I tell this story a lot, but it's like my most favorite floor time like experience. I fell into floor time because my OT best friend, partner in crime, who you would love, Karen McWaters, we were working together and we shared a couple of patients, and we weren't friends at the time. I knew I wanted to make her my friend, but I told her that later. And we were at sister clinics that were like they shared a parking lot. So we'd pass patients across the parking lot, and we saw this one child twice a week, and she would see him first and then I would see him first. And we'd like have conversations about what we were seeing. And we started to see this parallel of development. Like we were both seeing similar things. We started to understand like from that language and motor perspective, like how those were really aligned. And we were both very child-led, and she's brilliant. And she was like, you need to look into floor time. And so we went through some of the floor time courses together. And this child, he, some of his individual differences, autistic, he had apraxia of speech. So he had some other dyspraxia motor wise, and he had a true love for like certain, care, like deep, a lot of the kids we work with have very deep interests. And so he loved Mario, he loved Zero from Nightmare Before Christmas, and like every month it would kind of shift. And so we'd use what he was passionate about to build. That's what was all nice about floor time. Whatever you're interested in, we can work on it. And he started ABA because, it's hard for caregivers to find support. And I empathize with that. Like, I can only provide 2 hours a week, and I totally get that. So he would go to ABA for like 8 hours, and then he would come to our session with an idea. Like he would come with an idea every session, and he would trust that we would get there. But his speech, he had a lot of, not very fluent speech. It was very effortful. And he had these very symbolic ideas that are hard to communicate when you don't have as much of that symbolic speech. And one day he came to our session with a piece of paper, just a piece of paper. He took this piece of paper from home in the morning, kept it at ABA, and brought it to our session. And he sat in the chair and he had this idea. I knew he had this idea. My favorite thing to teach kids to say is, I have an idea. And he coached me through for 45 minutes. It would be like circle, around, stop. So I like cut a circle, and it was just a circle, and he put it on his face. He was like, no, use scissors, big circle, around, stop. And so finally I like cut the paper. I need tape, help, tape ear. So we taped this piece of paper around the circle. I need more paper. So we found more paper. He's coaching me through this full time, and we're co-regulating the entire time because this is incredibly challenging.
Emotionally charged and
emotionally
exciting.
charged. You're excited about this idea. You want to make sure the message is received. I'm with you. We had been working together for like a year. We built this relationship. We taped his feet. I like brought somebody else in because I'm not a good crafter. And we finally get to a point and he starts like hopping around the room and making some sound effects. And I was like, but I trusted him. I wasn't like trying to change his idea. I trusted him. He trusted me. And finally I realized that he was the Pixar lamp.
Oh.
And so he literally woke up in the morning and said, and I won't cry this time, but every time I tell the story, I cry. He woke up in the morning and said, I'm going to go see Miss Erin and Miss Karen, which made it challenging and easy. Miss Erin and Miss Karen. And this is what I want to be. And he was able to hold that idea because of our relationship through the entire day and bring it. And we spent 45 minutes. I can't imagine how challenging. We went back and forth. We used affect. He gave me emotion. We were together. He trusted me. We had this, and he was able to build this idea that I don't know how else he would have, if he was ABA, that would never have happened, because like that wasn't, how do we, and the beauty is like, how many of our kids have these big ideas and they don't have the support to get there? And that was so beautiful. And he developed so much frustration tolerance and so much emotional regulation and so much affect and so many means of communicating meaning all through that entirety, and built resilience in that he's going to be able to carry that somewhere else and bring it with him, because he knew that he got there and now he was confident that he could have this idea come to fruition. And like, that's what's important. Not did I get him to say certain words in our session? Great. Like,
yeah. And that's another thing that I kind of like touch on with parents is like, the journey is so much more valuable than the destination. So when I worked at the Floortime Center, we had the panda room, and this was the room that had all of the symbolic toys. And it was kind of this like inside joke, but also not an inside joke, that like, as therapists, we didn't love this room because it would be a lot more challenging to engage with some of our kiddos that needed that sensory input, or that were still in kind of sensory motor based play, not in that symbolic play level, in a dynamic back and forth. Individual time, you play with those Peppa toys until you are exhausted. Like, that is totally fine. But when you are working on this shared, social reciprocal back and forth where we're communicating and problem solving and co-regulating, I'm going to keep that panda door closed. And so we, that was the one room that you could lock from the outside and the key would be hanging on the top of it. And so, kiddos, they would start to figure out that like they needed to get that key. And so I had one little boy, he knew that the key was up there because the week before he remembered that Diane had to get the key down. And again, you're finding that just right challenge. The first week, he just initiated with me that he wanted to go in that panda room, which is a big thing for this little boy at this time. So he initiated with me just gesturally and with that joint attention, not necessarily looking at eye contact, but he referenced me as he's trying to open it. And you can see this kind of frustration affect. Oh, it's locked. Oh, man. And not focusing on the language that I'm using it, but how I'm using it. And so I went and I've got to get the key. And I opened it. And we went in and we played with those toys until I had no more symbolic ideas left. But then the next week, he wanted that key again because he remembered a toy that he wanted to get. And this is where that journey part comes in of, oh, that key is up top. I knew he knew that if he could communicate with me, he would get in there. But instead of just automatically doing it, and this is where that active participation and that pause, there's so much power in pausing, comes in. I just stood there. Oh, I can't reach it. So you know what he did? He came over and he pulled my arm to get up there. So that is that social problem solving. You're working on co-regulation through this really emotionally charged moment, because that getting into that room was like getting into a toy store. It was just everything that he could have wanted. But then the next week, so we just kind of kept making it more challenging. And that's where finding that just right challenge and having the relationship and understanding the individual differences of your child in that day. There were other times I didn't love this room for the purpose of like connection, but I loved the connection that we made in the journey of getting into this room. Other times I would be sitting on the ground, or I fell asleep, or the key. So we just kept working on this. And sometimes it would take us 20 minutes to get in that room. And it's not like cruel and unusual punishment. Right. We're having a good time. I'm running away. He's chasing me. He's pulling me back. I'm falling. We're enjoying this moment, which is what floor time is. And we got to the point where like he could follow and sequence several steps. So I made it like into a scavenger hunt to find the key because it wasn't up there one time. And I playfully was like, oh no, Mr. Jake must have hidden our key. Like, so working at the Floortime Center, it was like all of us women. John was a man. We had a Mark who was a floor timer who's awesome, just a floor time partner. But then Jake and Tim were both these like 6'6" tall guys, but they were just the warmest and sweetest, and like we used them in whatever way we could. So Jake had taken the key, and so we went into, I was like, maybe Jake took it or maybe Tim took it, and Jake had taken it because we found a note in Jake's room, and I read the note and it said, the key is somewhere cold. Instead of saying it's in the refrigerator and giving the child the idea, he came up with ideas for where we could find this key. And first we looked in the refrigerator, it wasn't there. And so then he was like, I was like, somewhere else that's cold. I was like, maybe in the microwave? No, that's hot. So you're modeling all of this really purposeful language. There's something I think on top of the refrigerator. So instead of it's in the freezer, you know, you're exploring language and letting them come up with this idea, because it's going to be so much more meaningful and impactful. So that's just kind of like one example of using floor time in a session. And everyone has a space, hopefully, that if you're a therapist or a parent, something can be up high, or it can be in a locked cupboard, or it could be in a box behind something else that you've got to move things. You know, there's always ways to kind of playfully obstruct, not just obstruct to obstruct, but using that playful obstruction strategy when you have that relationship and you're on the team. And that's the other thing, is like the kiddo is the driver, and I, as their partner in that moment, or I'm coaching the parent and just being the partner. You are in the passenger seat and you guys are a team. It's not me telling you what to do, how to do it, to make this progress, which I, you know, can't even really confidently say is progress. But yeah, you guys are doing this together. You are partners.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it truly is, you know, very, very challenging, very skilled, very fun. And yeah, like you said at the beginning, it's not just letting kids do whatever they want to do. It's understanding their motivation and why and what they're interested in. Because, you know, I hear all the time from people, well, when they're in the real world, like, this is why they need ABA so they can, you know, engage it. And you're like, that's why I'm challenging. Because in the real world, no one's going to be telling them exactly what to do. They're going to have to come up with their own ideas. And that's what we're building. And we're building that ideation and that resilience in understanding that like somebody's going to listen to them and work through their communication and their ideas. And it's and you also just feel it. Like that's the other thing. Like some of floor time is just like you feel it. And I can't always describe, like Santa Greenspan talks about, like the gleam in the eye. That doesn't always mean they're looking at you. That doesn't always mean, like, the gleam can look so many so different.
Feel it.
Yeah. And allowing but you have to be in the moment to feel it. And a lot of times I think in therapy that I was taught to do, it's like, you're always scared about the next thing. So I always have to prepare for the next thing. And floor time gives you permission to just be. Like, can we just be with each other? Because for a lot of our kids, just being with somebody else is hard enough. So can I just be? Can we be together? Can we feel connected? And
and you have to work on that. You know, I have plenty of parents, and I've seen plenty of times firsthand, like if a kiddo is, and that's why I don't love symbolic play manipulatives coming out right away for kiddos that I don't know yet, because you are going to have to compete and likely lose to that symbolic play. But I have had my hand pushed away. I've been pushed away. I have been told no. You know, you have to find that just right way of joining in that world. And I think, again, taking it personally, you do a disservice to yourself and the child, because, oh, they don't want to play with me. Like, I'll just go over here. When in reality, like, no, you just got to pull back and try again a little bit differently. And I think, you know, taking those sensory systems into account, like you might have a kiddo that's just hypersensitive to that sensation of like, someone's in my space, they're moving too fast, they're talking too much. So their kind of fight or flight, their like nervous system reaction is just to push you away. So finding the way, and there's a way to use language without using too much language, but you know, it's talking about what you're doing while you're slowly doing it. so that the child has all the opportunity to process, like, I'm coming, my fingers are coming. So it's finding that playful way to join them in their world without, frustrating them or dysregulating them or surprising them.
Yeah. Yeah. I know I could talk to you for
I know.
hours. Like Michelle said, we need to bring you back because we didn't barely touch
Yeah.
on feeding. We barely, like, there's
I
so
know.
many, and I spoil, like, I think that would be really awesome because I really don't, it's hard to find someone that like really understands floor time and really understands feeding on like a very deep level. And so I would love
Yeah.
to talk even more about that because I think people are really, the feeding world has been a little slower to shift from a very behavioral based lens. And there's so many better ways to do feeding. And
Yeah.
we understand that our neurodivergent kids play differently, that they communicate differently, but then we ask them to eat food in the exact same way. And, I think there's just so much to go there. So we will have you back. I'm very grateful to have you. If people, where can people find you? If they, have questions or want to reach out or happen to be in London, want
Yeah.
services.
I love it in person. I go home to Florida a couple times a year too. So have done like intensives. Since, when I go home, I can see a family for an entire day or for 2 full days, and I just kind of drive home in the evening. But so I currently live in London, in Southwest London by Wimbledon, which is like the tennis club. I see kiddos in their homes and their nurseries and their primary schools, or I think I mentioned I've got a space that I share with other independent therapists now, which has been really nice because you know what you have there. If you want to pull out bubbles or shaving cream, because before, or like some sort of, like, heaven forbid, I need to do a sensory motor activity, like I would just have to pull pillows off of people's couches. But you should have seen me with my like backpack and my bags, like taking the tube, going all through central London, and everyone is like dressed up so nicely, and here I am in my like floor time clothes. But so I see kiddos in central London, and then I also provide consults virtually. I do like Zoom calls like this. I do just calls there. Sometimes it's an occasional let's talk through this. Sometimes I've got regular kiddos that live in different countries that I have sessions with. And that part of it is really parent coaching. And parents, when they first reach out to think about virtual services, they're like, does virtual work? My kiddo doesn't want to sit in front of the computer. And I'm like, okay, good, because I really want to spend time with you as a parent to support your interactions with your child. And this computer is almost like a necessary like a gate, so I can't actually get in there. It really challenges me to provide parent coaching on a level that is really purposeful and really like something that they can latch onto instead of me just telling them or showing them what to do. So yeah, I'm in London for now. I don't know how much longer. But yeah.
Awesome. And you're on Instagram. What's your handle? I forget.
Yes, it's Floortime, FLA, because my business is Floortime Florida. Because I thought I would live in Florida the rest of my life. So it's Floortime, FLA.
Perfect. Yeah, life has a funny way of shifting what we think is going to happen.
Exactly.
But yeah, thank you so much for coming. We'll have you back for sure.
Awesome. Yep. Thank you. It was so nice chatting. And like I said, like living with my little bubble at Floortime, I didn't really need other people in that moment because I had several OTs and several other speech therapists and these other professionals. But now after leaving Floortime, it was like, whoa, there was more of us out there. So it's really nice to kind of get to know you over the last few years.
Same. Thank you.